Welcome to a special bonus episode of Cinemaholics. Don't worry, we're going to still be coming out with the main show later this week. We're going to be reviewing The Lovebirds, a bunch of other new releases. Obviously, we're excited to talk about that. But for now, we are going to do kind of this bonus show to cover some pretty significant news in the movie industry world. And you know it's significant because we very rarely talk about movie news, but this is a big one. So to help us do it, we actually have a special guest we're going to introduce shortly. First up, as always, I'm John Negroni of Adam Tickets. Sadly, my usual co-host, Will Ashton of Cinema Blend, he's not here today, but filling his shoes, we are so very lucky to have Cinemaholics writer Sam Noland here. Sam, how you doing?
I am doing just fine. I'm very, very eager to talk about this because it's something that it's something that there's a lot of conversation around. So excited to see where it goes. Yes.
Yeah. Same here. And you know what? We are so honored to welcome our special guest this week. He is a film critic, producer, writer, so much more. Not only has he been the Movie Fights champion and the 4-time Singles Movie of Trivia Schmodown, he's also a writer and producer on a little thing called Honest Trailers, 4-time Emmy nominated. I mean, look, you've seen his work all over YouTube, including his film reviews, and he actually has a brand new channel he just launched. Welcome to Cinemaholics for the very first time, Dan Murrell.
Hello. How are you? Well, thank you for having me.
Dan, we're so glad you're here. I'm doing pretty good, and I think this is the perfect conversation because I've always wanted to invite you onto the show. We met a few years back doing the Pixar movie fights. That was a ton of fun.
That was great, yeah.
Really glad we could make this happen. But what have you been up to these days? Like, what do you have in store for this new channel? I'm sure the listeners want to hear all about it.
Yeah, we launched just over a month ago, and it's been a real adventure. You know, I was so long at Screen Junkies and hadn't really worked at all in the YouTube space before that, and so it is definitely a different animal when you're out on your own, but it has been a really fun, exciting adventure so far. It's just I'm doing reviews, which I've always done and always loved doing, and I'm continuing to do those, the ones that I can. It's great to launch a channel that's largely based on movie reviews when there are no new movies hitting theaters. It's wonderful timing on my part.
Yeah.
But also just kind of stuff that I like to do. I made a video about RoboCop, and I made one about Jaws, which are two of my favorite movies. And then this week, it's weird how it works out sometimes. You know, the Snyder Cut video that I put out this week was probably the quickest turnaround I've ever had on a video, from I'm doing a video to I'm posting it. And it's now like probably one of the, other than the launch video, the highest viewed video that I have so far. So it just goes to show you the flexibility of it, and just being ready to roll with the punches. It's something I'm still learning about, but yeah, it's really, I'm just trying to kind of build a place for people that love movies, that want to talk about movies, new movies. I'm developing and launching soon a format that's based solely around classics. And then, movies that I love and why I love them. It really is just kind of a place for people to talk about movies, to largely love movies. We take our pot shots as well. But it is really rooted in a love of film. And I'm having a great time so far.
Awesome. Yeah, super stoked just personally on what you're going to be doing with that channel. We're going to link to it in the show notes, of course. You can find it on YouTube under Dan Murrell. And yeah, tons of videos already. You've been working hard. And in fact, you mentioned the video that kind of prompted me to be like, oh, I really want to hear what you have to say about this on Cinemaholics, and we can talk to you about it. And that is what you mentioned, the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League. So let's talk about it. Big news this past Wednesday, HBO Max announced that Zack Snyder's heavily speculated, long wanted by a huge fan base, his director's cut of the 2017 movie Justice League will come out sometime next year in 2021. It's going to be going on their new streaming service, like I mentioned, HBO Max, which is kind of like a HBO Now, but with like the larger Warner Brothers library. It's going to be a pretty massive thing. And that's a whole episode of Cinemaholics unto itself. But yeah, so Snyder himself actually announced the news as well. He was doing a viewing party for Man of Steel. And I'm actually going to read an official statement from Zack Snyder about this. He said, I want to thank HBO Max and Warner Brothers for this brave gesture of supporting artists and allowing their true visions to be realized. Also, a special thank you to all of those involved in the Snyder Cut movement for making this a reality. And I also want to read this statement from Warner Media Entertainment Chair Robert Greenblatt. He said, since I got here 14 months ago, the chant to hashtag release the Snyder Cut has been a daily drumbeat in our offices and inboxes. Well, the fans have asked, and we are thrilled to finally deliver. At the end of the day, it really is all about them, and we are beyond excited to be able to release Zach's ultimate vision for this film in 2021. This could never have happened if it weren't for the hard work and combined efforts of the teams at HBO Max and Warner Brothers Pictures. So a lot to unpack there. Let's break this down. Dan Murrell, what is the Snyder Cut, and how did we even get to this point?
Oh, what a long tale to weave. Zack Snyder was, after following Batman v Superman, was the director, and he is still the credited director for Justice League, the version that came out back in 2017. He had a very personal tragedy. His daughter took her own life, and so several months before the film came out, he stepped away from the project, and Joss Whedon was brought in to finish Justice League. And in that process, there were many reshoots done. There have been conflicting reports, and insider reports are so hard to parse because you never know where they're coming from. But that the studio wasn't happy with the movie, that they brought in, some say they brought in Joss Whedon, that Joss Whedon stepped in to finish it. Some people say they brought in Joss Whedon to fix it. I don't know. I wasn't there. But it resulted in the theatrical cut, the cut that was released back in fall of 2017. We all know that movie did not do well and was not received particularly well by many fans, and certainly not by critics. And almost immediately, because they had started promoting Justice League, trailers had already started coming out. There was material in the trailers that was not in the film, that was obviously from Zack Snyder's version of the movie. And so starting with analyzing that, and then as reports came about how much of the movie was reshot and how much Zack Snyder had not completed in the sense of it was completed and done and ready to go into a movie, but had shot and how much had been assembled into an edit, there almost immediately began a demand to release the Snyder version or the Snyder cut of the movie. And that has been the narrative really for now almost 2.5 years, really. And it is something that has been hotly debated amongst fans, amongst people that do media analysis like myself, the journalists. It really did the movement was massive. There were protests in front of Warner Brothers. There was billboards at Comic-Con. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere in the movie space without seeing this release the Snyder Cut movement. The crux behind the video that I released was, and I'll admit it, and I'll admit it again, I never thought there was a chance in hell that this would ever be released, because the state that the cut was in, you knew that they would have to put tens of millions of dollars into finishing it in order to present it in any way that felt finished. And so I didn't believe that would ever happen. Not in a million years. As it turns out, the decision was made by Warner Media to do just that on HBO Max. They're going to be pumping reportedly $20 to $30 million into what Snyder had done to get it into a state where it could be considered at least finished or presentable, and fans will get to see their Zack Snyder's version of Justice League after many years of lobbying the studio to do so.
That's right. Yeah, I have to say I was kind of on that same train where I really thought this was unlikely. I think I've gone on the record on Cinemaholics of saying, like, the chances are so slim because the amount of money they would have to spend on a movie that's already lost them 9 figures. It was kind of a huge hill for them to climb. So I do want to say, like, there's good reason to assume that this would never happen, but I think the conditions kind of came in, like, just the right ones. What do you think, Sam? Did you predict this? Were you thinking this could happen someday?
I've had an interesting history with this, and I think it's important to remind everyone that Zack Snyder directed Man of Steel, and then he directed Batman v Superman, and then Justice League. Justice League was planned to be sort of a part one of a 2-part saga that Zack Snyder was going to also direct the second part of. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that there was also going to be a 5th movie that they never specified. And somewhere after the release of Batman v Superman, after the very negative response to that, mostly by critics, that was when they decided to kind of course correct. And it was at that point that the vision, Zack Snyder's vision, I should say, that was when it started getting shifted, started getting course corrected a little bit. So I think this is sort of one of the early examples I can think of a trend that started to emerge in the past, just like 3 or 4 years, of movies that are part of big franchises that have, in one way or another, sort of gone out of their way to meet demands of viewers, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think one of the early examples, and not a lot of people think about it this way, but when you look at Thor Ragnarok, a lot of that movie, especially the first act, is sort of centered around undoing all the weird loose ends from Thor: The Dark World.
Yeah.
Marvel was clearly willing to sort of playfully like resent everything that they'd done in that earlier movie in favor of taking it in a different direction. And I think it worked to pretty decent effect in Thor Ragnarok. And that came out just a couple of weeks before Justice League. Another one like that was not as big of an example, but Godzilla King of the Monsters. The Gareth Edwards movie was criticized a lot for not showing enough of the monsters, whereas Michael Dougherty's movie really kind of went the exact opposite direction, to the satisfaction of a lot of fans. I know a lot of people who dearly love that movie for specifically that reason. I have my problems, but what are you going to do? And then it kind of came to a real head with Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. That's kind of the ultimate example of this. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I have to imagine that that Warner Brothers would have been perfectly content with releasing Justice League, the theatrical cut that we got, into the ether, had there not been that rallying cry to release the Snyder Cut. I feel like they would have been perfectly content with just leaving that movie be, because in the DCEU films that have been released since, they've gone in a direction that's clearly a lot different. Yep. Like Aquaman hardly references the events of Justice League. I think there's one line of dialogue to that effect. Shazam has basically no connection, and Birds of Prey is only connected to Suicide Squad tangentially. So they're not as into the interconnectivity as they were when Snyder was kind of helming the entire series in a way. Like Wonder Woman and Suicide Squad aside, Zack Snyder directed the majority of those movies leading up to Justice League. So I think there's been a lot of artistic sympathy for Zack Snyder. I think that's what all of this really boils down to. So I'm very curious. I think that's what it boils down to. I think I'm optimistic that it'll turn out all right. So that's kind of where I stand, I would say.
I thought of two things after you brought that up. I thought of the demand to fix Sonic the Hedgehog, a pretty recent example. And also, speaking of hashtags that have been satisfied.
I know what you're going to say.
Well, I don't know if you do. Justice for Han?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. That's another thing.
Oh, wow. That is a good one.
You know, probably a gentler movement, but still pretty feverish. I know I've always appreciated Han from Tokyo Drift, Fast and Furious, and he's coming back. So.
Naturally.
Anyway, let's talk a little bit more specifics about this assembly cut or this final cut or whatever you want to call it. Starting with you, Dan, I mean, what do you think this cut of the movie might be like? What do you think they have to do to make it salvageable, like to make it a version of good that will satisfy the most amount of people?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When I released my video, I said there were many things that I got wrong. I think there was one thing that through the development of the story that was confirmed that I thought and that many thought from the beginning, which is that, the cut itself was not and is not ready to just, if the cut was ready to be released, they'd probably release it tomorrow because they're launching HBO Max. They of course they would want it there, but it's in the same shape that any movie would have been if work were stopped or if it was adjusted many months before release. Unfinished effects, unfinished score or no score in a lot of places. Sound design and sound mixing and editing to be done. They said that they potentially are going to be bringing in actors to do additional dialogue recording. It's a rough cut. It's what every movie, especially a movie of that size, is many months before production, which is why I always thought that it would never really see, unless it was presented as kind of a work print in a way, similar to how, but not exactly, the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, which it has some additional work done, but is mostly an assemblage of what they could get to make an approximation of what the finished product would be. There's some screen test stuff in there, and it's not a final version. To make it a final version is going to take what they're putting into it. Tens of millions of dollars, effects to be finished, sound to be done, score to be written, additional involvement from the cast. And so, I think if we're to look at right now, like what is the Snyder Cut's form, it's probably a lot of green screen, a lot of unfinished VFX shots, no score. It's a rough cut. It's an assemblage. It's not a polished product. And so the investment to get it there is going to be hefty, but it seems, well, that doesn't seem like it. This is the stated goal of what Warner is going to do, is they're going to put that money into getting it where it needs to be, because, there's so much that is done even in the last weeks before a film is released that Snyder's version never got to, because they came in, they reshot, they restructured, they cut out reportedly a lot of material that we could now be seeing for the first time.
Right, which is why it could possibly be extremely long. So like I know that image that Snyder himself put out was, I think the original cut he was working with before he left post-production was 214 minutes. For context, what they ended up with was a movie that was just barely 2 hours. So, which is 120 minutes to give you an example. So almost double the length. So there's been talk that, this could be a 6-chapter series akin to how Netflix sort of re-edited The Hateful Eight to be a little bit more salvageable for a streaming service. And that seemed to work out to some decent success. I know for me personally, I prefer Hateful Eight from start to finish. I think you do too, Sam, if I'm not mistaken.
I actually have not seen the miniseries version, so I wouldn't know. I do love The Hateful Eight, though.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, you're going to have to get back to me on that, because as somebody who also enjoys that movie, I'd be curious if you think that format works. But yeah, did you have a take on this too, Sam? I mean, do you think that this is just going to be another Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition where it's just a few extra things, it's not that different? Or do you think this could be like drastically different?
I think it will be drastically different. I think this is a very unique beast we're working with here. And I think there's a reason that they're putting so much money into this. We've seen other movies like this, such as the extended editions of Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit even, or the God knows how many cuts of Blade Runner that have been put out there. The difference with those movies is that they were already completed like as is. And with the exception of, a few shots that they might have added in after the fact, releasing those was just a matter of adding in those scenes that have been deleted, picking them up off of the cutting room floor, so to speak, and inserting them into the timeline of the movie. This is sort of, it's, as we've said many times, it's a movie that sort of never got to be in its final form. And so I've read various reports. I've heard that the Martian Manhunter was going to be a character in this version. I've heard that Darkseid, one of the biggest villains in the DC universe, was going to have at least a bit part role as opposed to just being alluded to in the theatrical version that we got, and various other things such as Willem Dafoe was originally going to be introduced as his character from Aquaman in Justice League. I would imagine there would be more background on the various heroes as opposed to just them sort of showing up and joining the team immediately, which is more or less what happens in the theatrical version. An hour, like an hour and a half and change is a lot of time in movie time. That's a lot. And especially considering that it's very likely that they'll end up cutting out a lot of the scenes that Joss Whedon had shot, whether for wanting to redo the same scene in a slightly different reason or just getting rid of it entirely. There's going to be a lot of extra movie here. We'll probably see a lot of those scenes that were in the trailers for Justice League that never made it into the movie. I think it could be very interesting, and I think it'll be a different movie. I'm not sure if it'll be good or not, as is true with any movie. But yeah, that is for time to decide. I'm hoping for the best. I think the thing that I find fascinating about the DC Extended Universe, as it's called, is that there is, to a certain degree, almost every single one of their installments that they've released has had some sort of controversy, as opposed to, let's say, the MCU, where almost like every single installment is almost unilaterally accepted as being at least pretty good. Like they strike a pretty decent 3.5 star tone most of the time. And we can usually agree on those movies. Whereas the DCEU, opinions are all over the place. I mean, there was a time, I don't know, like, do you remember this? I'm sure you do. When Batman v Superman was like one of the most controversial movies out there.
Still is. It's weird to think.
I mean, it is.
Trust me.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
I wish it wasn't, but
I don't have my finger on the pulse of the discourse campfire as much as you two do, but in my personal experience, it's not as toxic as, say, Star Wars, for instance. There's of course a lot of toxicity, but there's also a lot of chivalry to these DCU fanatics that I've observed, at least in passing. And I think the rallying for this Snyder Cut is not out of some sort of how should I say this? It's not out of some sort of demand to have their needs very specifically met, like we had with something like Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. It's, I think, artistic integrity is what I used before. They thought that this movie was sort of unjustly treated at the end of the day, and they want to see that rectified. And so I think it comes from a good place. Let's hope it pays off. It's in monetarily and spiritually.
Sure. Yeah. I think we're going to get into a little bit of that shortly. But first, I do want to ask, because you kind of brought this up too. It's like, why would this be happening right now? I think the timing of this is very interesting, and the conditions are sort of just right for something like this to come out. Specifically, we can talk a little bit about kind of the obvious elephant in the room of what's been going on in the movie industry right now, and why it seems like production involving visual effects and things people can do from home might actually be worth the resources put into it for this to come out on a streaming service. But yeah, Dan, so like, what do you think prompted Warner Media to finally say yes to this? I mean, obviously some of it is fan demand, but a lot of it is logistics too. So what do you think about that?
I think, the pandemic, it probably played some part, but I've seen a lot of people giving the pandemic full credit for this. I wouldn't necessarily go that far because, if you read the original story, this is a discussion that had been going on reportedly, at least as far back as November. There had been a screening of it in February, which would have been at the very outset of the pandemic here, at least in the US. So I'm sure that the pandemic perhaps was a factor, but I don't think it was the driving factor. I think it was perhaps a case of, Warner Brothers is now in a much larger world. I mean, you have Warner Media now. The studio doesn't just exist on its own. It's particularly with HBO Max now. They have an outlet, and that's really. I heard a lot of steam getting picked up. It's like, well, Warner has HBO Max. Why don't they just put it out there? They have an outlet. They have a play. It's not like you have to put it in theaters. So I think it's a combination of having their own streaming service and those streaming wars, as we've called them for a while, picking up, and everyone is on the hunt for what's something that can draw eyeballs, what's something that can draw subscribers in business. That's a pretty big one, to put the Snyder Cut on there. And it's a factor that honestly I didn't consider and wasn't even a factor for this entire thing. Warner didn't announce their streaming service until about a year after Justice League was released, as far as like that they were even doing one. I also think that it's kind of alluded to in the statement from the chair, from the Warner chair. There had to have been a factor. Anything that Warner Brothers did, anything that Warner Media did, anything that DC did was immediately set upon by the Snyder Cut fans. Sometimes it was when it was related to DC stuff, but I'm just talking about any Warner movie, anything. Like we made a joke about it because, as with every fan base, there were some people in the Snyder Cut fan base that took it a little too far, or a lot too far. Not everyone, but some, as happens with every group of fans ever, anywhere. But the one that I think we pointed out in one of our honest trailers or in the one of our something that when I was at Screen Junkies is that even when like Lorraine Warren died, who was the person that they based The Conjuring on, her and her husband, the top things underneath were like, okay, but release the Snyder Cut. I mean, it was everywhere. So, and they mentioned that in the statement, just like, it has been in our inboxes for 2.5 years. I do wonder at a corporate level if at some point they just sort of looked at the numbers and said, like, it might be worth the investment to do this if it means that we can now move our property and our company on from this and just say, like, okay, we did it. And I think that's going to be a component of our discussion later on about if that sets a precedent. But I do think that, while the pandemic may have played a part, I think a much bigger part was the fact that they have an outlet to do it. It's a competitive marketplace. It's another way to make revenue. So you don't have to just worry about, are people going to go see it in a theater if we put it in a theater? Are they going to buy it on Blu-ray if we put it on Blu-ray? Now it's like, are they going to pay for a subscription for our streaming service if we put it on there? And also, I think that there may have been, particularly at a corporate level, a desire to just say, like, you know what? Let's do this because, we need to move on. We need to be able to move on. The fans have been at the forefront of this movement, but I also think that a big part of it was because, we covered it in real time. It was certainly present, but it had sort of reached a bit of a dull roar when the actors and when Zack Snyder himself started pushing for it. I think that's another factor is right. That I think put it over the finish line. The fact that Zack Snyder was actively saying, like, I remember it. There was the first time it bubbled back up was he was at a convention and somebody asked him about a Snyder Cut and they said, when are we going to see the Snyder Cut? And he said, ask them. And that skyrocketed it right back up to the top. And then he kept, he sent out I was going to say tweeted out, but he's on Vero. He Vero'd out the film cans and said, like, here's the cut. And then, you had Ben Affleck, you had Jason Momoa, you had Gal Gadot, like you had all of the actors saying, release the Snyder Cut. And he himself was saying, like, it exists. You should ask for it. That's also a big reason was they actively campaigned with the fans and said, keep pushing. Keep doing this. Keep asking because it exists. And I think that ultimately is what pushed it over the finish line.
I think that's right. I basically agree with you because I think that they probably were planning to do this and they were probably putting the right moves in place to make this happen. I do think I think the tricky thing is how they're going to handle marketing this with HBO Max and separating that from the Matt Reeves Batman movie, because it depends on how they frame it, right? If they frame this as like the closure to the first saga of the DCEU so that they can move on, like you're saying, and then go on to, okay, here is a new Batman, here is it. But part of me wonders is like, is that really the right move? And because are people going to have an issue with Robert Pattinson in this world to the extent they already are? And is this going to muddy the waters? Is this going to be another Jared Leto, Joaquin Phoenix thing where these alternate characters are sort of conflicting with each other? So that's part of why I've been wondering, did the pandemic sort of drive them to maybe doing this a little faster so they could release this a little bit more time before that movie comes out toward the end of next year, and hopefully there'll be enough separation there. We really don't know for sure. We don't know what production issues they've been running into because of everything that's going on. We don't know what content they might have had planned for next year that has now been put on hold that we haven't even heard of yet. And so there's tons of factors, but I think, the bottom line is it's going to be coming out and it is going to be this thing that for better or worse, is going to be the signifying end of this long running campaign from this fan base. So taking a cue from that, I want to ask you guys about a tough question to answer, because this can probably set off alarm bells in people's heads. But, does this set a good or bad precedent for the movie industry? I want to bring up Joanna Robinson, wonderful entertainment writer, wrote for Vanity Fair. She called this a long and occasionally toxic fan campaign that mixed good-intentioned fundraising with coordinated and vicious social media attacks on critics, myself included. Has one company, in its desire to stir up attention around the launch of its streaming service, HBO Max, emboldened, quote, bad fan, end quote, behavior? Or is this just the normal of fandom ownership in our social media age? We don't have the time to fully answer this question, and it's a long thing, but I do want to get just sort of your quick take on it. I'll go to you, Sam, but what is your take on this? And I know that you certainly have some strong thoughts about toxic fandoms. I know you and I have talked a lot about how this is, like you brought up earlier with Star Wars, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we've seen this kind of pattern grow a lot. I mentioned those various examples of movies that have kind of resulted from this kind of behavior, but this is definitely a huge sort of like kind of revelation in it, when to the point where they're spending as like a ton of money, like a astronomical amount of money on this, considering that it's not going to be a big theatrical release or anything. At least we don't think so now. And so I think the whole thing about emboldening bad fan behavior is something that definitely needs to be taken into account. But I also think it's strange to think how this specific occurrence will have ramifications in the future, because as I said already, this is a very unique situation here. This like very rarely happens to this extent, where there's a version of the movie so different from what we got that a campaign can even just theoretically be centered around it. So I think we might not see this exact thing happen again when it just comes to release the blank cut, just because it's not really feasible most of the time. But yeah, we have seen this grow a lot, and I think it's going to be important to remember that. How should I say this? I wouldn't say this is necessarily like a victory of the fans over Warner Brothers. But then again, this is the very early stage of this. We've still yet to see how it's actually going to play out in the long run. So I think it could turn out all right, or it could spiral completely out of control. It's kind of a boring answer, but it's the diplomatic one. We're just going to have to wait and see. So yeah, I'm fascinated by all this, and so I hope it turns out all right, because wouldn't that be nice?
Same here. I mean, I think to what you're saying, you can make the case that part of what really, I think, Dan, you mentioned this, like part of what really persuaded Warner Brothers wasn't the toxic fan behavior, it was the good intentioned fans. It was the ones who appealed to Zack Snyder, who would then appeal to the other members, or to the members of the cast and the other people who worked on the movie to make this happen. That's at least what it appears to be to me. But what's your take, Dan?
I mean, it's a very complicated thing. Like I mentioned, the bad apples a lot of times get the most press, and there was a lot of money raised for suicide prevention through this movement. Yeah. And, a lot of them, and I saw them in my comments, a lot of the folks that were pushing for this are very happy. They are, they have a perspective on this that's healthy. They were just, they were advocating for a version of a movie. And I think what sets this apart was it was a version of the movie that already partially existed. That's what I think sets us apart from a movement like Remake The Last Jedi, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars of an undertaking, which is, you could say that I've learned my lesson, but perhaps I haven't. But I can say with a fair amount of confidence that Disney is not going to pump $200 million into remaking The Last Jedi.
I hope so.
I will say that with a fair amount of confidence.
We'll see you back here in 2.5 years, Dan.
Exactly. Yeah.
Heyo.
Just bookmark that quote now so I can apologize for it in 3 years. I see the point regarding the bad fan behavior because, I can speak from a critical perspective. The time, that you get feedback all the time and a lot of it's good, some of it's not so good, but the very few times that I've had to sort of separate criticism that I've gotten, not even criticism, that I've had to separate threats that I've gotten around a review for a film have been for DCEU films, 100%. And I think it's because they attract a very loyal and a very passionate fan base, obviously. But the ones that go over the line tend to go way over the line. And so that draws a lot of eyeballs. And so I see this, and I've had it. I see this suspicion or this kind of view of particularly the DC movie fan as this very extreme fan. I understand why people have that method because they are very loud and they can get a little scary sometimes. I'm not going to lie. But I think what this has shown, especially with the reaction, is that most of these fans, most of them were legitimately in it because they liked Snyder's previous work and they wanted to see the realization of that vision. And that's what they're getting. So it's very easy, and I have done it as well, to lump all of them into the toxic fan pool. When as a matter of fact, it is not even close to the majority. It's just many times happens to be the loudest. And again, like I said, that happens with the fan base of almost everything now, especially in the social media age. I think when you talk about setting a precedent, I mean, we've had two high profile cases in the last year. We've had Sonic, which was, completely redesigning the character at great expense. And now this. But these studios, they're not running charities. They're not running like a please the fan charity. I think that it's in their interest to keep the fans of their stuff happy, but I don't think the Sonic move would have been made or this move would have been made if somebody at the studio or the parent company didn't think that they would either make money or that by not doing this thing that it would lose them money. I think that was the case with Sonic. I think they realized that if they kept that design, it would probably lose them money and overshadow their film. And I think someone at Warner Media probably decided that this would make them some amount of money. So I think you're right. You can take certain lessons away from this, but ultimately, I think that what's going to be taken away is that studios. Sonic was a pretty successful movie, and I said this in my video. If the folks that have supported this and have advocated this for so long show up and you see a big boost HBO subscriptions and they make money off of this, I think the precedent that it may set is that it will give studios. They may put a little extra weight into these movements because it's proven that it can either not lose them money or make them money. I think it helped Sonic's case. We'll see next year when this comes out what it does for HBO Max. So I don't think this is going to set a precedent where everything the fans want they're going to get, but I do think it'll give the studios that extra ammunition to say, let's look at the economics of this. And let's see if it's worth doing this in a way that they may not have done before.
I couldn't agree more about what you're saying there in terms of especially that minority of fans being so loud and so vocal, and how that shouldn't drown out a lot of what has been done and has been correctly good intentions. So let's move away from this cut and finish out with a little bit of fun speculation on what are some other cuts you're curious about and would maybe like to see one day. Will Ashton, who couldn't make it, he did want to chime in here and say he wants to see Josh Trank's cut of Fantastic Four, which I don't. I'm just gonna say, like, I don't care. I don't want to see it. I don't.
That's
I'm not
number one on my list.
Is that the one you're going to
is.
bring up? Oh, okay. Then please talk about it. Why do you want to see this one?
The Trank cut of Fantastic Four was definitely number one on my list because I certainly did not enjoy 2015's Fantastic Four. However, I felt like the first half of it, the part that it seems like before the studio took it over, I thought the first half of it was at least something interesting. And I don't know if I necessarily liked it, but I would have walked out of the movie going like, I don't necessarily know if that worked. but it was a really interesting take on this group, and it was at least something different. And in the middle of the movie, it became something completely not different at all. It became just the most watered down version of everything you've seen before, and it kind of invalidated the weirdness of the first half. So I would actually love to see Josh Trank's cut, because I think that Fox got cold feet. I think they thought the movie was too weird. I think they thought that it was too much of a downer and that it wouldn't attract a big enough audience. And they went in and they said, we know what audiences want, and they turned it into the most generic thing in the world. I would like to see, like, maybe it would get worse, but I was at least interested in the first half of Fantastic Four. And not at all interested at the literal half. I mean, there's literally a screen that it cuts to. It should just say cut to studio notes, and the rest of it is all studio notes. So I am on board with the. I would love to see that version of the movie, because I don't know if it'd be good, but I think it would at least be interesting.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The second half of that movie is hard to remember, actually, at this point, but I do remember how I felt, which was not good. I only wanted to bring up one movie here. There's a bunch of cuts, but the first one that I thought of was Brenda Chapman's cut of Brave, which doesn't technically exist. There's probably only just storyboards of it, but I've always felt like Brave is the kind of movie that really feels like out of nowhere it becomes a totally different thing that doesn't really jive with, like, really the first 30 minutes, which are really good in that movie, in my opinion. And there's been a lot of bad blood and a lot of tension between Chapman and Pixar for reasons that may have to do with Lasseter eventually getting ousted and the creative differences between her and him, and then her getting replaced by Mark Andrews. All of that is, to my opinion, just a real shame, because Brave ends up being one of the weirder missed opportunities for Pixar movies. So that's mine. Sam, what do you got for us?
There are a lot of, like, unmade movies that I would love to see. Jodorowsky's Dune is kind of the go-to example for that.
Absolutely.
Stanley Kubrick was going to direct a Napoleon movie had he gone on to live longer. But the one that came to my mind first is not so much like an alternate, cut of the movie, so much as it is an extended cut. The original First Blood from 1982. I believe the assembly cut came in at around 3 hours and 30 minutes. And they cut that down into the movie that we got, and all that extended rest of the movie has never seen the light of day. And I don't know about y'all, but I think the first Rambo movie, I want to make that very clear, the first one only, is really good, actually. Like, it's actually quite good, and so, like, just the last thing that the sequels would make it seem like it was. And so I would love to see just 3 full hours of Vietnam remorse being expressed in this movie. That the version we got was quite good, but I would love to see the rest of it. And the other one is one of the oldest examples of this exact thing, which is a movie that you've probably never heard of if you're listening in the audience. It is a 1924 silent movie called Greed, directed by Erich von Stroheim. Yeah. The original cut was in the ballpark of 8 hours long, and two some odd hours is all that survives, plus another hour and a half of, like, storyboards they've been able to vaguely reconstruct with screenshots. I've seen the movie. It's fantastic. And it's a really slow burn. I want it even slower, damn it. So it's lost. It does not exist. Unless it's in some film canister in like Paraguay or something, and no one knows about it. For all we know, it's out there in the world somewhere. Maybe someone will find it one day.
Right, yeah, because they reconstructed it, right, once, and it's still not even close to the original runtime.
Yeah, they've reconstructed it. Like, you can watch it; it's available. The short version, I should say. And finally, this one actually is not unlike the Snyder Cut. This one actually is getting released. A movie that's almost 50 years old. The Day the Clown Cried.
Oh, God.
Was never released for the longest time. And it's a movie. It's a movie where Jerry Lewis, yes, that Jerry Lewis, plays a clown who entertains children in World War II before they go into the gas chambers. what the hell is this movie?
Didn't he direct that too?
He directed it. He wrote it.
And he reportedly had it like in a briefcase that he kept with him, like in his office. Wasn't that didn't he say you could release it after he passed away?
Yeah, I think that was one of the stipulations. If memory serves, 2024 is the date when they're allowed to screen it, just because of contract stipulations and what have you. Jerry Lewis did not want this thing to be out. He was either ashamed of it or embarrassed by it,
or he wanted a time capsule or something.
Maybe so, or maybe just wanted to be really famous one day. Of course, he's no longer with us, but that'll be fascinating to see once it finally comes out.
The Library of Congress does have a copy of it, don't they?
That's going to be the only way to screen it. Let's just hope it's not completely mediocre, because wouldn't that suck? I want it to be...
It's got to be terrible or a masterpiece. Otherwise...
Or weirdly amazing.
Harry Shearer is the one that I remember. There's some people that have seen it. It's like a handful of people that saw it.
Really?
But yeah, that's just... Yeah, I do feel like, though, that might be one of those where the legend is bigger than the film itself.
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah, it'll probably come and go relatively quick, but there'll be a little sliver of time where The Day the Clown Cried is finally out, and I can't wait to live that long.
Hopefully that'll be a day very soon, right?
John, you're a Pixar guy. I've seen... Do you know how much of the Toy Story version existed where Woody was just an angry dick? Like, because I've seen like like the storyboards with the voiceover that was like when they almost canceled the whole movie. But like, did they record the whole movie that way?
So I was at the 20-year anniversary just out here in San Francisco, and John Lasseter was there, Pete Docter was there, Andrew Stanton, and they were talking about this. And they did say, I think a vast majority of it had been storyboarded. I think the whole thing actually had been storyboarded. And they had only done the voice acting for a few segments of the film. And I think they showed Disney, like, not the complete film, but kind of like a version of the film just quickly outlined. But this is like way before, or not way before actually, this is right before they had actually done the Army Man sequence, which that is what saved Toy Story from actually coming out, because that was an idea. I think credit goes to Lasseter for that, I want to say, either him and one of the other animators, who was like, we got to come back to Disney with something to save this movie, because you're right, the Woody being a jerk thing, that is like totally what almost sunk that movie. But also Toy Story 2, right? Like that movie got deleted. And so they almost lost that movie. That would have been a lost movie if fortunately an animator had it illegally backed up to their home computer. And then I think there is a version of Toy Story 2 very similarly that never came out because they decided this is good enough to be a theatrical, so they just sort of redid the whole thing. But yeah, Pixar is definitely well known for they're more secretive about this stuff. Like we really don't know what Newt was going to be. We don't really, Good Dinosaur is probably one of the only movies we have actually a lot of details, like the voice cast and like what they were going to be going for before they fired Bob Peterson and Pete Stone came in and just redid it. So I don't know if I want to see that Toy Story cut. That would have been just depressing.
Yeah,
that sounds like a creepypasta of some kind, like something that like you'd have to take a shower after watching the Angry Woody cut.
It's weird. Like they put a few maybe 30 seconds in one of the making of documentaries, and it is off-putting. It is very off-putting.
Where he's just like yelling at Slinky, and it's just like,
oh my goodness.
And it's Tom Hanks' voice, so you don't want it.
No.
All this is to say, release the Peterson cut. One day.
One day very soon. But all right, thank you both so much for coming on and talk about this very interesting movie news topic. Again, we don't talk about movie news often on Cinemaholics, but definitely thought this was warranting a lot of discussion. Dan, thanks so much for lending your voice and your insights as well. Don't forget to check out his YouTube channel, Dan Murrell. Again, it's totally linked into the show notes. And Sam, I know you've got tons of stuff going on. As always, we're going to plug your letterbox because that's where the action is for you still, right?
Day in and day out, baby. That's where I spend.
Always plugging away.
That's where I spend
there.
pretty much all my time. Oh yeah.
Do you have anything left to plug, Dan, before we head out?
YouTube.com/Dan Murrell Movies is my channel. I'm also on Patreon. patreon.com/Dan Murrell. That's where you get all the stuff on YouTube. I try to throw that up there a little early. Also, I do a monthly movie club. We're actually wrapping up our first month now. The patrons choose the theme. So this month the theme was movies that defined me. So I picked 4 movies. I picked An American Tail, which is the first movie I ever saw, and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, E.T., and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. 4 very key movies for me growing up. So we're going to be doing the discussion of that this week, and then we're going to be picking the theme for June very soon. And then I also do a commentary. I did a commentary track for Jurassic Park, and I'll be doing another one of those for June. So a lot of really fun stuff. We're having a great time over there. So, if people check out the YouTube channel and want to take an even deeper dive, you can find me over on Patreon and on Twitter @MurrellDan.
It's funny you mentioned Jurassic Park, because that would probably be in my 4, since I'm more of a child of the 90s, so that kind of works out. Great tease. Definitely check that out, and we'll see you all next time.